Okay, I think we've stabilised numbers now, so a huge welcome to everybody. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Introductions first of all. So my name's Andrew Thynne. I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, have been for 5 years or so, well, since we started actually. I'm also a board member of the Crofting Commissioner, and I also work for the Prisons Inspectorate. In fact, I'm in Edinburgh at the moment doing prisoners work. So that's me and that's my background. And before we go any further, I'm going to ask others to introduce themselves. So Megan, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Megan McInnes. I'm one of the appointed Scottish Land Commissioners. I'm joining you from Applecross over on the west coast, where I'm part of a crofting family, and I'm also employed as a local development manager with the Applecross Community Company, which is the local development trust in the area. Very much looking forward to hearing about what's going on. Thanks.
Megan, thanks very much, and you'll hear shortly from Megan in more detail. Lorne, I can't actually see Lorne, but Lorne, I think is, oh, there's Lorne. Lorne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. My name's Lord Mcleod. I'm one of the Scottish Land Commissioners. I'm based in Oban. I've been involved in and around land reform for the last 30 years. Prior to becoming a commissioner, I was the chairman of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland, and I was on the board of the buyout of the Storrs Ooge, which covers the islands of Eriskay, South Uist and Benbecula in the Western Isles, co-opted member. And my day job is I'm a chartered accountant and I'm in business, and look forward to hearing the discussion later and finding out what are the key issues in the northeast of Scotland. Thanks, Chair.
Lorne, thank you very much indeed, and you'll very much hear from Lorne further as well. And last but certainly not least is James. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, thanks and good evening. I'm James McKessick-Leach. I'm Policy and Practice Lead at the Land Commission. So I work in areas around land rights, so both legal and human rights, governance, and also land access for agriculture, particularly for new entrants and progressing farmers, so a mixed bag.
That means he's a jack of all trades, and he is. He's superb. He's, you know, if you've got a question on almost anything, ask James. Mixed bag. I've heard you call it that before, James. Good one. Right. So huge welcome. That's the people here from the Land Commission. Also here, but you can't see her, is Jess. And Jess, in addition to keeping all the technology flowing and all the rest of it, will during the evening post links to further information on things that you actually wish to talk about with us. So Jess is in behind the scenes, and I'll explain further in a minute the sort of format and how we use the chat function and so on. But just before I do that, I just want to say a few words about why we do this. Because since the beginning actually of the Land Commission, we have held public meetings every month, and actually up until the pandemic, we held a public meeting in a village hall every month somewhere around Scotland. And it was hugely important, and it shaped, particularly at the beginning, it shaped the things that we focused on in the first few years. And it still does, it still shapes what our priorities are and what we should be focusing on. So, you know, don't underestimate the importance of contributing to this conversation this evening, because if you wish to influence what is being done in your name, and we are public servants, so you should be holding us, you know, challenge us, hold us to account. We are, you know, that's absolutely right. Take your chance to tell us what you think of what we're doing and what our priorities should be. It's very important. But when the pandemic came along, the village hall thing collapsed, and for a few months we actually didn't have a public meeting, and I started to get withdrawal symptoms in a way, because I really enjoy this kind of thing and the interaction with people. So we tried online, and I was fearful of it, but I have to admit that I was wrong, and it's been very successful. It's enabled a lot of people to join us in these meetings who simply couldn't otherwise have joined us, because for whatever reason, they couldn't get to a nearby village hall. So we're now continuing to do them online, at least for just now. We're not going back to village halls. We may well go to both. We'll have to see. I've got an open mind, frankly, because I think there are there are strengths about a village hall public meeting that you miss online, and there are strengths about an online meeting that you miss in a village hall. So we'll see. But for the moment, we're doing them online, and they continue to be popular. They continue to be pretty important. The format, so we've used the same format now for a while. It seems to work. The purpose, as I said earlier, is to have a discussion with you, have a conversation with you, listen to you, hear you, be challenged by you. That's the purpose. The format, because not everybody in this meeting will know much about what we do, and some will know a lot. We're going to give you a wee presentation, or rather Megan is, a wee presentation for about 15 minutes or so, and it's inevitably a quick skim over what we do, but it will endeavour to make sure that everyone has a sort of rough idea of what we're involved in, so that that provides you with a sort of basis for the conversation. But after that, we want to have a conversation with you. To do that, we've essentially got two options. There is a button on your screen which says chat, and there's a wee bubble on it. If you click on that, it enables to contribute your thoughts by just typing them in. So if that's the way you want to contribute, then please do click on the chat. Certainly what Jess will be doing will be putting up links in there to further reading if you want to use it and that kind of thing. But please use the chat to contribute your thoughts, and I'll try and keep track of what everyone's saying and then draw that into the conversation. But probably more helpfully, or as helpfully, would be if you would click on one of the other buttons where it says raise hand or something like that. Click on that, and a wee other hand will come up beside your picture, and I should see it, all being well. And then I'll ask you, one at a time, and let's keep this sensible. But I'll ask you to unmute yourself and contribute your thoughts verbally, and that works really well as well. So if you want to contribute verbally, use the raise hand, or indeed use both and type away and use the raise hand, whatever you like. But we want this to be a conversation. We'll want to listen to what you have to say, and then from time to time I'll pause and go back to Lauren or Megan or James and say, well, look, let's have your thoughts on what you've heard so far, and we'll try and make it interactive like that. And we'll just see how it goes. This is a kind of, it's just the meeting will evolve depending on what people are interested in and what they want to talk about. So let's do that. I promise, I think we've already promised in the advertising, but I promise to finish by 8:30. So if you've got to go and sort your granny out or something, I promise it will finish by 8:30. I hope you can stay with us until then, but obviously if you have to leave early, that's unfortunate, but absolutely fine. So that's why we're doing this. That's how we're going to do this. And I think it's probably quite enough from me. Megan, I'm going to hand over to you. Megan's already sharing her screen, so you'll see a slide up there. And Megan's going to just take you through a wee sketch of what we do, who we are, that kind of stuff. And then we'll have a conversation. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Andrew, if I can get this presentation to work. Yes, so I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so giving a brief overview of who the Scottish Land Commission is and what it is we're up to. So we've been tasked with driving forward land reform, but what is land reform and why is it important? So land reform is about making sure that we are putting our land to the best possible use across the whole country as we step forward and meet a whole range of different and difficult challenges. So it's about changing the pattern of land ownership. It's about the tenure and management of land, for example, agricultural tenancies. It's about making sure that it's about looking at the role that land plays in carbon sequestration and increasing Scotland's natural capital. But it's not all about rural areas, it's also a critical process in urban areas. And the recent focus on taking steps to tackle vacant and derelict sites in the heart of our urban communities is a good example of that. And I'm going to speak a lot more about this in detail later. Land reform is also about looking at how you plan and make decisions about a piece of land. And of course, it's about community land ownership and community engagement in decisions and control about land. The Huntly Development Trust has been getting a lot of attention recently about all the success and the impacts of their steps to take on ownership and control of land and assets in their area. So I hope we get to hear more about that this evening, as well as what's going on in Fraserburgh and Peterhead and the rest of Aberdeenshire. So ultimately, we see land reform as a vital part of efforts to ensure that communities across Scotland are successful and are places that people want to live and work in. And land reform is central to the big public policy challenges we currently face. The economic recovery after the pandemic and the current crisis, the need for affordable housing, the need to build resilient communities and to respond to the climate challenge and the biodiversity crises. And it's for all of these reasons that the Commission and its staff feel so excited about what we're doing and the potential for reforming, own and manage and use land across Scotland and what that can do. So who are we? Well, the Scottish Land Commission is one of the outcomes of the 2016 Land Reform Act, and we were formally established by the Scottish Parliament in 2017. Our role is to provide advice and recommendations for the changes required in law and policy to move the land reform agenda forward, as well as the changes that can happen more immediately on the ground in terms of culture and practice. And whilst we do make recommendations to ministers in different parts of the government, we also make recommendations to a whole range of other stakeholders at every level. We are a national organisation and focused on making more of Scotland's land for the benefit of all. We are 5 land commissioners and 1 tenant farming commissioner, Dr. Bob McIntosh, and we're supported by a small team of core staff, including James and Jess, in our office in Inverness. Now, before I get into the detail of our various activities, I want to talk a little bit about a key Scottish Government policy which underpins everything that we do, and this is the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. This statement is another outcome of the 2016 Land Reform Act, and it's the first of its kind in the world in terms of articulating the relationship between land reform and the human rights frameworks, recognising that along with the rights to land, as a landowner come responsibilities to your neighbours, to your local community, and also responsibilities in terms of making sure that that land delivers for the public good. And the Scottish Government has just today published a revised version of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. I think Jess is going to be adding in a link to the new version of the statement. It has 7 principles now, and one of the changes in the statement is greater recognition of the need to connect our thinking about the role of land and land reform in response to the wider challenges we currently face, particularly around the climate change and biodiversity crises. So prior to this statement, the protection of property rights used to be perceived as a barrier to land reform. But through this statement and other provisions in the 2016 Land Reform Act, Scotland is moving in line with the rest of the world in recognising that human rights can actually be a springboard in terms of progressing land reform, and that land reform help to fulfil our human rights obligations. So as I said, this Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement sets the direction for the land reform agenda in Scotland and for the Land Commission's wider programme of work. And this question of how the different human rights can be better balanced between each other is continuing to be a key topic within the current Parliament. We have a new land reform bill, which is currently being consulted on. I'm going to talk about that later, as well as a new human rights bill coming onto the agenda. I should just say as well, I don't know whether Jess or James, you can add the link to this, but my colleagues in the Land Commission are going to be holding a webinar on the 20th of October, which is going to be about the changes within the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. So that's something to sign up for if you're very keen on this particular piece of policy. So in terms of our specific work, so we're about halfway through our current 3-year strategic plan, and that has 3 different work streams: reforming land rights, reforming land markets, and responsible land ownership and use. And as Andrew said, Jess is going to be putting up links to various specific pieces of work as I go through these different parts of our work stream. So the way in which we own and use land influences the distribution of power, wealth, resources and benefits in society. And this means that achieving wider government objectives such as tackling inequality and responding to the climate challenges require us to reform these rights to land. And we're doing this in a number of ways in which are all looking at changing the ownership and governance structure relating to land. So we're continuing to support the government objectives to have a more diverse pattern of land ownership. one of the first pieces of research we did back in 2018 looked at some of the barriers to communities taking on ownership of land and buildings, and that continues to be a theme across all of our work. We've also been supporting new governance models, which can widen the range of people who benefit from land, particularly looking at Europe, where it's much more common to have a hybrid governance models across different types of entities. And we think there's some really important lessons that can be learned from there. We're also going to continue to address the human rights relationship between property rights and the wider human rights that relate to land, those that are known as the economic, social and cultural rights. A piece of work that continues to inform our reforming land rights workstream is the research we took back in 2018 on request from the government to better understand the impact of Scotland's unusually highly concentrated pattern of land ownership. In the spring of 2019, we published the results of this research in a series of proposals for how the negative impacts caused by this pattern of land ownership could be addressed. And this focused in on tackling the damage being caused by monopoly land ownership and monopoly and control over decision-making about land, including the introduction of a public interest test for large-scale land transfers. These recommendations have now been taken forward in the consultation of this new land reform bill, which is focused around modernising the regulation of land ownership in Scotland. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the session. Closely connected to ownership of land is the question of how land markets function. And this is an increasing role of our work, particularly in rural areas. I'm sure all of you are aware of the recent changes in the rural land markets and rural land values across Aberdeenshire, and we're seeing similar patterns across the whole of Scotland. Over the winter last year, we undertook some research to try and understand what's actually happening in terms of these changes in the land market trends. And that was the first and main study from that was published in April. And fundamentally, this research showed that although the amount of land coming onto the market had remained low, the demand for that land had increased dramatically. And it was that increase in demand matched by continued low availability, which was one of the causes for increasing land values. And the demand for land was coming from a number of reasons. We've got increasing interest in land for carbon sequestration and natural capital projects, for example, peatland restoration. But we've also got strong interest in tree planting and woodland regeneration, to some extent due to the government's policies around tree planting and targets for net zero. So a core area of our work in terms of recommending changes in both policy and practice in response to these changes in the land market have focused on how Scotland can best realise the opportunities that are coming from this situation, as well as best manage the risks. So we've looked at, for example, what does responsible practice and investment in the land market look like? And how can the risks for local communities be minimised, and how can the benefits be fairly shared? Another key piece of work that we've looked at since we were established in relation to the land market has been tackling the problem of vacant and derelict land. So, and this has been a major focus for the last 5 years. There are around 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict sites across Scotland. We've got 70 sites in Aberdeenshire alone, totaling 250 hectares. That figure nationally has remained pretty much the same since the mid-1990s. It's a really entrenched problem, and one that disproportionately affects our most deprived communities. Because these sites are not only a blight on the local community and the neighbours, but they are also a big missed opportunity in terms of what else you could do more productively with that land. So together with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, we established the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which has brought national attention to the issue. And we've published a series of recommendations for how this land can be brought back into use. And there's a huge amount of work now being taken forward, particularly by local authorities, to think about delivering these recommendations and bringing these sites into better uses. Another piece of work in our land market, our reforming land markets workstream, has been looking at the way in which land is being made available for housing and for development projects. So a year ago, we published the culmination of 2 years of research that looked at how land is being brought forward for housing and how this process needs to be reformed in order for the housing sector to be able to create places that people want to live in at prices they can afford. And the key conclusion is that the current market-led model is simply not delivering affordable houses, particularly in rural areas and in urban town centre regeneration zones. And that instead what we need to see is a much greater leadership role being played by the public sector and public bodies. The final area I want to highlight in terms of the current work around the land markets is our work that's looked at the relationship between land reform and taxation. Land and property taxes have the potential to help to achieve long-term outcomes for land reform, to support an active farming community, to help diversify land ownership, to support town centre regeneration and meet these net zero targets and the just transition in terms of the climate challenges. So the Scottish Government asked the Land Commission to provide advice on the potential role that tax and fiscal policies could play in supporting both the wider land reforms as well as broader economic recovery and resilience work. And this work the work that we did was informed by an expert advisory group that was chaired by Lord Mcleod, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any questions you have about this area this evening. And we published the final results of that back in the start of this year. And our recommendations focused on two areas. First was around future options for taxing land values, and secondly was around the future reform options that tax and fiscal policies could play in supporting broader economic recovery and land reform objectives. So the third and final work stream is around responsible land ownership and use, with the aim of making sure that whoever owns or manages a piece of land, they are doing it in a way which is responsible and accountable both to local communities and the wider public benefit. The core of this work stream is supporting landowners and local communities of all types to implement the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement on the ground, and we do this through the Good Practice Programme. So this is about supporting that high-level government policy that I talked about before that's just been revised and published today, which is setting the direction for land reform across the country. So as part of this programme, we've developed 9 protocols. We've given specific advice to over 150 local landowners and communities in the last year. And we've also developed case studies and other guidance and tools. This work is now evolving as we begin to look at how this Land Rights and Responsibility Statement can be mainstreamed within the operations of the private sector and the public sector. And we've also been working with local authorities who had already decided to take on the community wealth building approach to look at the ways in which we can align, or the opportunities for aligning land reform objectives and community wealth building in the operations of these specific local authorities. Now, separate to those work streams, of course, is the work of Dr. Bob McIntosh, who is our Tenant Farming Commissioner. So Bob and the team have a statutory responsibility which is focused on improving relations between landowners and tenant farmers. They've published a series of codes of practice and respond to inquiries around those codes. They have been focusing a lot recently on recommending mediation as a way of improving relations between tenant farmers and landowners rather than looking to legal recourse. And they've also been supporting new entrants, particularly young folk who want to get involved in the agricultural sector. For example, we co-launched the land matching service and have been looking a lot recently on succession planning. So there's a huge amount of work being done by Bob and the team that aren't just focusing on improving relations within the sector, but also the overall effectiveness of the tenant farming sector as a whole. So one other element of our work that I wanted to bring to your attention is the MyLand Hub, which is an online platform that's full of case studies and podcasts and other sources of information about how individuals and organizations have changed even the smallest piece of land around them and had a transformative impact on their community as a result. The reason we've set this hub up is because we wanted to break through this idea of land reform being somehow really geeky or really, really technical, and just give some really solid and concrete and inspiring examples of how important land is to our everyday lives and the lives of those around us, and give you all some inspiration of what you could do yourselves. So please have a look and join the conversation and share your stories. We've got a website and also on social media. And one of the most exciting parts of this information hub are the podcasts, which are hosted by Callum McLean. He's interviewed a whole range of different people, including Darren McGarvey, and most recently with Judith Doherty, who's the chief executive of the Gridiron Theatre Company, about what they've done to transform the Leith Academy for their latest performance. Now, before I finish and hand back to Andrew, I just want to make sure that you're all aware about the fact that the Scottish Government is currently holding a public consultation on a new land reform bill. As I said already, the consultation is to some extent based on recommendations that we made, for example, around tackling scale and concentration of land ownership, but it's also much wider than that. The consultation was originally going to close on the 25th of September, but this has been extended now for another month till the end of October. And it's great as it gives us all more time to respond to these really important proposals. So I just want to make sure that you are aware of the opportunity you have now to give your views on these proposals. The consultation itself is easy to find on the Scottish Government's Consultation Hub website, and I think Jess is going to put that up in the chat box now so that you can have easy access to it. And before I finish, one of the things we do during these events is ask for feedback so we can improve them in the future. So if you have the technological ability to click on this QR code, you can complete the survey that way. Otherwise, it will be sent in a link in the chat function as well. So please do give us feedback and help us improve for next time round. And I'm going to hand back to you now, Andrew. Thank you.
Well, Megan, thanks. Good feedback for you as well. Thank you, much appreciated. Okay, so let's open it up now. We want to hear from you. As I explained before, if you want to talk to us, please raise your hand, click the raise hand button, and I'll bring you in. I should be able to see you. If for some reason you've raised your hand and I'm not asking you to speak, it means that I've done something stupid and you'll need to put something into the chat and I'll get you that way. If you don't want to speak, you just want to use the chat, that's great, please do. And Dennis has already done so I will pick up your point, Dennis. So let's just deal with that one briefly. So Scottish Government introduced a requirement on all public bodies to work towards sustainable economic development in 2007, I think it was. I'm not aware of I don't know about the Wales example. I'm going to ask James if he does, but he may well not. But in the chat, James, Dennis has asked, oh, there's Dennis. Well, actually, let's go to, Dennis has got his hand up. Julian, I know you were first, but Dennis, I'm going to come to Dennis because he started in the chat. Dennis, why don't you just speak to this? It might be more helpful than me trying to sort of guess a bit.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the Welsh Government introduced what's called the Wellbeing and Future Generations Wales Act 2015. And the interesting thing about that is it looks at sustainability for future generations, for stakeholders that are not yet born. You know, so that this is for stakeholders in the future, and it places fairly onerous obligations on all public sector bodies. You know, educational authorities, schools, municipal, local authorities. Every time they want to come up with a new building development, and there's an interesting case of a new cancer centre being built in Cardiff, which on NHS land, which had met all these sustainability criteria. The Health Board appointed very highly respected consultants and others to ensure that all the development met all sustainability standards. But a local community group formed a very well organised social media campaign, took the project to judicial review twice, and stalled the project because they felt that the sustainable development that they wanted was not being met by the Health Board, who were, you know, being advised by some of the UK's leading consultants on sustainable development, and were coming up with a highly carbon efficient building, and took on board all sorts of ecological, environmental, and, you know, spent a tremendous amount of money on ensuring that the best standards of sustainability were met. So we had this bizarre situation where, paradoxically, there was an argument that went to court about what was sustainable enough. And interestingly, the decision went to, I think this happened the first time, and Our House, that's AAHAUS, Our House Convention decision, in which the social media groups got all of their legal costs paid for by the health board. So we have this situation where, action groups got involved, Extinction Rebellion got involved, lots of other groups got involved in this. And there was this huge kind of disruptive campaign that's taken years to resolve. And I'm just wondering that, if there's going to be future legislation like that introduced into Scotland, that it needs to be done in a way that we can get away from this kind of toxicity that social media polarizes views, and get some kind of, let's just call it, for the want of an old-fashioned term, civilized debate. And I'm just wondering whether the Scottish Land Commission would have the remit to kind of bring these parties together at the early stages of these projects, so that these things can be addressed at the very beginning, rather than allow them to fester and ending up with courts becoming our theatres of democracy, which is a prospect which worries me very much. We don't really want to have socially valuable infrastructure like new cancer hospitals being delayed because there's different views on who thinks something should be sustainable enough.
Yeah, and if you go to what happened in the Aberdeen Orbital Road, which is a bit closer to home for most of you, and in Wales, we saw a very good example over there. Dennis, thanks very much for that. We'll clock that. When I invite the others to come back into this discussion, if they are familiar with that, they'll say so. If not, I've clocked it, and we'll look that up. Thank you. Can I also just, Dennis, if you haven't already done so, please respond to the consultation on the Land Reform Bill 2023, because it's one of the most open government consultations I've ever seen. It pretty much says, what do you think about X, Y, Z? And then at the end it says, and have you anything else to say? So for goodness sake, have something else to say and take advantage of that. It's a most unusual consultation. It's the link. Well, if you go to our website, there's a whole page about it. Please do that. Now, Julian, I'm not very sure. There's two people on the slide, on the photograph, only one of whom's called Julian. So I'm not sure which one of you wants to speak, or indeed if both of you want to offer a thought, please go for it. You're muted, Julian. That's it.
Yeah,
right.
Okay. I'm his daughter, and I'm helping with the technical stuff as well.
Okay.
But I also registered, but it's easier. It will save the data if we just use one computer. You see.
That's wonderful. Well, feel free to contribute your thoughts as well. It'll be valuable as well to hear from you. Julian.
Well, the main question I wanted to raise relates to recent developments in Riney, which is not far from where I live. And what has happened is that a large farm was put on the market, and it was bought by a gentleman who basically intended to use it entirely for growing trees, which of course would be subsidized in the ways that is under the net zero goals and so forth. And there's a great deal of annoyance and distress in the village of Riney, partly to do with the way that the forest is being planned, which is really not going to give very much of a resource for the local community. Very, very little in the way of native species, nearly all the kind of fast-growing Sitka that is planted all over the place by the Forestry Commission and so forth. And there's also the fact that all the farmers who wanted to buy the land and farm it were outbid and could be outbid because of all the money that is being drawn in by the net zero goals and so forth. I don't know if any of you have seen a couple of podcasts by Neil Oliver, but he does, in two of his podcasts, he drew attention this was before I knew about this issue in Rhynie. He drew attention to the fact that basically a large amount of agricultural land was being bought up in many countries, not just in Scotland, for the purpose of basically getting carbon credits, which would allow aviation to continue unfettered, as it were.
Private aviation.
Private aviation, yeah, particularly, well, his spin on it anyway was that they all wanted this in order to go on flying their private jets. I've no idea whether the gentleman who's now bought this land intends to use it for that purpose or any other purpose, but we know that he intends to cover it with a very, very high proportion of Sitka spruce, very, very few token areas of native species. And it's already the case that the Forestry Commission tends to plant an awful lot of fast-growing foreign species and doesn't reforest Scotland with native species. And I'm wondering whether either of these issues to do with the outbidding of the would-be farmers who wanted to get access to more land, and the issue of the nature of the afforestation, whether native species are encouraged rather than fast-growing Sitka and things like that. I wonder if that's of any interest or relevance to the activity of the Commission.
Julian, thanks very much indeed, and it's hugely relevant, and I will definitely pick that up with the others when we come back round.
Can I just add really quickly? I won't waffle on like my dad does. I will be much more concise, I promise. My general impression has been partly with the Rhynie woodland plantation, but also in terms of there are several proposals on the nearby Cabrach for many more huge wind turbines. The proposals, funnily enough, it's all landowners. Some of them are, in fact, several of them are absentee, if I'm allowed to use that word. And what it seems to me is you've got these, I would call it a whole load of mutually incompatible policy aims, which the Scottish Government has. But the problem is, for example, you've got then, okay, they want the just transition, but equally they want food security, and equally they want rural repopulation, and they want local communities to feel that their voices are heard and that uses of land, change of land use is for their benefit. And it seems to me from what our experience locally that this is just not happening. These are all clashing. But what is ultimately speaking, funnily enough, is it's the power of money, it's the big landowners and the people who actually have to live near where this change of land use is happening. Their views are, there's a kind of what I would call full consultation.
Thank you very much. Dad's never a waffle, I should probably just say that. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to Doreen and then I'm going to pause because you've raised some pretty huge issues and I think we should sort of circle round on those. So Jeff, forgive me if I could ask you to be patient, but let's hear from Doreen and then we'll circle around some of the Land Commission people. Doreen.
Thank you. It's okay if you want to go back and add some of these because my questions are more around the urban side of things. So
well,
if you
Doreen,
want,
yeah, if you wouldn't mind then, Doreen, that's very kind.
yeah.
I think it might be, I'm going to take a look, I don't want to hold you up because I want to hear, urban is where people live and that's hugely important. But some hugely important issues have been raised by all three of the people who've spoken so far. And I just want to circle around a bit on that. James, can I come to you first? I mean, we have done an awful lot of work on this whole business of what's happening in the land market, carbon sequestration, tree planting, natural capital. And then Lauren, I'm going to come to you too, because there's also a hugely important dimension to this, which is about community engagement, community consultation, and we can talk about protocols and stuff. But James, maybe you could offer a few thoughts around what's happening and how government can, to be fair to government, it's got a, it was kind of the point was made in the question, it's got mutually incompatible objectives, but, voters are pretty fickle things. James.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And that, I think, is exactly the right place to start, is what do you want? And pass on to Lauren to talk about community engagement and the importance of actually understanding what's going on. And I think that might actually touch on what Dennis was talking about earlier, again, about the Welsh approach and, not setting up conflicts between things that are being done to communities, rather doing them with the community. But coming back to what we're seeing at the moment, there are two things that are really, I think, coming to a head in terms of decision points. And one of them is around the operation of the land market, which we've been looking at over the last few years. And as you rightly identified, the only qualification to own land in Scotland is the ability to write a big enough cheque. There is no other qualification for owning land in Scotland. And that's very unusual in the developed world. In most of Europe, there are different types of checks and balances, greater things particularly around planning regulation, land use change. And that's the second element that we're also missing in Scotland is a joined up approach to land use planning. At the moment, a lot of the changes go on purely at the whim of the landowner. Once you own that land, you can decide to carry on farming it if it's always been a farm. But equally, you can convert it to forestry, or you can apply for planning permission to build housing or whatever you like. There are obviously rules around that. There's a forestry planning system that people can participate in and make their views known, as there is with development planning. But it's also very limited, and there is no joined up vision at the moment. In Aberdeenshire, more widely, there is a land use partnership on a pilot at the moment, which people may be aware of. And that's something to potentially get involved with, because the pilot there is exactly designed to tackle some of these land use planning issues, to bring together landowners, local authorities, other interested parties, community groups and representatives to actually sit down and plan out what they would like to see across the region. So what does the future of Aberdeenshire look like, over the next 10, 30, 50 years? What's it going to look like in terms of agricultural production, land use change that will inevitably come with climate change, so whether that's new forestry or new types of crops or anything else that's changing as well. So being able to have those conversations. But I think ultimately it does circle back to those two issues around land use planning and the operation of the market. And in terms of the land reform bill going forward, that's where we'll look to see some of those measures to really scrutinise the operation of the market and make sure that some of those controls are in place to particularly check large or significant land holdings that potentially do cause issues in local areas, to make sure that they're scrutinised before they go through and that the public interest is safeguarded in the operation of that land holding going forward. But I think that's probably a good point to pass to Lauren, and the real importance of community engagement in both of these big areas.
Lauren.
Hey, thanks. Maybe just addressing Dennis's point first of all. I'm not personally aware of the Welsh example, but in reading your question on the chat function, there was a point highlighted about sustainable development and whether it would ever be seen in a legislative context. I would maybe just highlight as one example that under the Land Reform Act 2016, there was a specific provision of a community right to buy to promote sustainable development. And this allows the opportunity for communities to come forward if they wish to own a piece of land for various developments. Even though it was not for sale, they could bring forward a proposal that they felt that their ideas and their development business plan feasibility study showed that the land could be used in a more sustainable way than presently being undertaken by the present owner. And then a judgment would be made on which was the best to go forward. Now, that actual legislation hasn't been trialed and tested to my knowledge as of this moment in time, but there is an opportunity obviously to go forward on that basis. So that's just one example. But then kind of addressing Julian's point and coming on to talk more about community engagement. And indeed, the last actual public meeting that I was at in person, as it were, was down in Dumfries and Galloway, where a similar lot of questions had been put forward about farmland turning over to trees and woodland. So it is obviously a big issue, not just in northeast Scotland, but also in the south. We have undertaken to publish various protocols of best practice in terms of community engagement by landowners with communities. One of the proposals that is contained in the Land Reform Bill consultation is that our protocols actually get a legislative underpinning. So similar to the work of our tenant farming commissioner, where he has codes of practice which have a legal underpinning. At the moment, our protocols have no legal enforcement, but there is a proposal that they become so. So it would be mandatory to follow through on the various protocols that we have. So that might help strengthen the case of people locally who wish to influence or participate in decision making in relation to land use. So that might go some way towards that. The other aspect, before I conclude, because I'm aware there are other questions coming forward from other speakers, within the consultation, and I also would urge everybody to respond to that. One of the proposals is that much of the legislation is in relation to those land holdings of 3,000 hectares or over, and there are various parties out there already who I know are contemplating whether that threshold or that bar is maybe perhaps too high, and other land holdings maybe should come in within the parameters there. So that's obviously something that you have an opportunity for your ideas to go forward in terms of the consultation. But I think I just leave it at that, and Andrew, I'll pass back to you.
Lauren, thanks. And Megan's just put up a link to a blog by Jane Davidson about the Welsh, which is really helpful. Megan, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, I think this is a really important point. I mean, Dennis, yes, you're right. So the Welsh legislation looks forward in terms of meeting sustainable development goals in the future, but there are certainly conversations taking place, or that have taken place, between the Welsh and Scottish governments about what the framework that Scotland has and what extent it could start looking forward in the same way as the Welsh government does. And we've actually had conversations ourselves with Jane Davidson, who was one of the ministers in Wales responsible for that act, and she wrote a book that talks about that, which is really interesting. And she wrote a blog reflecting on land reform in Scotland and where it is in that journey. But the other thing I should say is that we mustn't forget that the Scottish government is already a well-being focused economy. Its national performance framework, the tools by which it measures progress, are based on sustainable development goals. So at a governmental level, we are already thinking about sustainable development goals as a means of measuring success rather than just simply focusing on GDP. And I think that is a really useful tool, and that's still coming down in terms of the extent to which that's being used as a tool for measurement at the lower levels of government. The community wealth building efforts that I talked about in the beginning, the approaches to community wealth building that are being taken on by many local authorities, I think will help to move that forward. Again, having said that, I think the point you made at the end, Dennis, about the need for civilized debate is incredibly important, and a lot of what James and Lauren have both mentioned about the importance of early engagement, community consultation, regional land use partnerships as being a way of creating a safe space for concrete discussion about how some of these tensions can be resolved will, as far as we're concerned, play an increasingly important role in terms of moving forward away from moving beyond the tension into kind of practical decisions about how a particular piece of land should be used. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So Dennis, I recognise that you're making a number of wider points. I absolutely get that. Some of them go beyond our remit, but they are noted, particularly the last point you put up, so thanks for that. And Hazel's point too about food security versus tree planting is central to this. In a way, what you've all done, Julian, forgive me, I didn't get your daughter's name, but the two of you, you'll need to put it in the chat or something, and Hazel and others, what you've done is underlined the problem we have in Scotland is that we have a highly unregulated land market, as James said, pretty bluntly, actually, and it is a real issue. I mean, I remember speaking to quite a major Scottish landowner not that long ago who doesn't happen to live in this country, and I said, why on earth do you want to own land in Scotland? And he said, well, I bought land in Scotland because I can do things here I can't do at home, which was disarmingly honest. And I think many people would argue that this is precisely why we need to think seriously about land reform, which is what the Land Commission was set up to do. We're a new body. We've only been around for 5 years. Because, land reform is difficult. It's not without its hazards. It's not without its unforeseen consequences and all the collateral damage, all these risks. So it's got to be done sensibly. But few people would argue that the status quo is particularly satisfactory. And if it is your view that the status quo is satisfactory, you need to explain why the rest of Europe doesn't agree with you. Let's move on. Thank you very much indeed to all of you so far. Doreen, thank you so much for your patience. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm in Fraserburgh, and we have problems in Fraserburgh with absentee landlords, with land banking, and that's stifling our economy in some ways. And with, I'm wondering about the definition of derelict. To try and not be too specific, we have a problem in Fraserburgh where there's a beautiful old building, and the owner will not engage with anyone to sell it. He covers the issue by putting a little A4 sheet in the window of this big building saying it's for sale, but he doesn't market it. It's bang in the centre of town. It's deteriorating rapidly. So I'm wondering if your body will have any powers over these issues. We've got rich people who buy up land. Every time there's a piece of land, it's a premium here at the moment, just because we've had a regeneration program. They buy it up, and it stifles, because they can outbid everybody else. It stifles anybody else, like a local businessman trying to, to expand his business, can't, because everything's bought, and then this guy sits in it forevermore. So I'm wondering if you're going to get any powers to deal with that.
Thanks very much indeed. You just neatly summarised why quite early on, and in response to public meetings, actually, we decided that we had to focus quite vigorously on the urban land market as well as the rural land market. Many people thought when we started we'd just be looking at rural stuff, but there is a pretty unregulated market in urban Scotland as well. And I will circle back round to the points you've made. We have very little power. We're not set up as a regulator, or at least not at the moment, though there are some questions in the consultation about the bill around that. We're set up to develop, good policy advice and legislative advice, and we have advised on legislative tools to deal with precisely the situation where someone owns a building and doesn't do anything with it. So I'll circle back to that during in a wee while, but I'd like to let some other folk in if you don't mind. So let's just hear from one or two others. Jeff, thank you for your patience. Over to you.
Hi. Where did I start? I think a lot of these problems, whether it be Doreen when she speaks of issues we have with the carbon capture schemes that we have, these so-called markets aren't really markets. They're being severely distorted by government policy, and that's something we have to really find a balance with. Wind turbines are being put up because it's very profitable to do so, but part of that again is government policy that made sure they're very profitable. In the case of wind, in the case of trees, we have the same. Riney, I'm very interested in, and I'm glad that some earlier, was it Julian mentioned that, and the local councillor for Riney. So I'm fully aware of the situation there, and one other site in my patch where they are basically taking arable land and forest and creating a forest, while at the same time claiming biodiversity. I would say, as I think Julian hinted at too, there's very little biodiversity in a spruce forest. Most of what is in there is pretty dead. And that's something that we have to look at and be very aware of. So there's lots of distortions in the market, and those have to be cleared up first. It's all very well, in my view, to go for carbon capture. It's all very useful, but perhaps we should be looking at it on sites that aren't arable. We are going to go through a period of where we're going to be looking for more and more food production. And as I've spoken to several officers in the council, we are looking at a situation where, in the Riney situation, the land is now, I think it's grade 2. That will be increased in future because of the movement of climate change, and how do we deal with that? It's difficult, and I don't know where we're going to find a balance. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks. Could I just ask you to just help us a wee bit further? Because you make the point that government distorts markets, but of course government distorts market. Any regulation whatsoever distorts markets. You know, a planning authority distorts a market, which presumably you're a local authority councillor. So what's can you just what is it that's worrying you? Because clearly, I mean, governments regulate and intervene, and they try and do so in the best interest of the public.
Yes, they should do, and it is good to have policies that encourage carbon capture, but they should modify, in my view, given my experience in Riney and another site in Kushney, which are both in my patch, as I said, we have to site these carbon capture systems on areas where it's very, very difficult to grow any other crop. There are lots of hills round about Riney and Kushney and elsewhere, particularly in the northeast, where you see the hills are bare, and yet we don't plant on that land. We plant on good agricultural land. So we're taking, as I said before, food production land out of the system. Now, the distortion comes from the way Forestry Scotland prices everything up. It's more profitable. It's Taylor's, by the way, Julian, who own the mains of Riney. They're a company in Aberdeen. And one of the reasons I believe they've bought it is they are, how can I put it? They're looking at several factors. The first factor is they're being subsidised upfront for planting the trees. I think it's something about £5,000 per hectare. They can get subsidised for hardwood, and they get more for that, but in the end, they get more money out of a faster growing crop from spruce than they do from hardwoods. But that's where the distortion is coming from. It's the subsidy that's coming from government through Forestry Scotland to grow the spruce forest. In a way, there's no real need for that, because spruce is a very marketable product. And if they modified it to only be grown on upland sites, or even to reduce the upfront grant to a degree, they would still have a marketable product, because spruce nowadays, they use it for building material, chipboard, biomass. There's lots and lots of markets for spruce. So in a way, the upfront grant isn't really necessary. And if that were reduced, or possibly even gotten away with, we'd have to discuss with everyone who's interested in speaking about it on that. But if that were reduced, we'd find that farmers would have a better shout in the land, because all of these carbon capture systems are increasing the value of the land because they're making so much money out of it.
Yeah, thanks.
And that puts the farmer out of the market.
that's fine, and I don't want to prolong this because there's others wanting in, but I think it would just help us a bit more. I mean, the council's a statutory consultee on this sort of thing.
Yes.
What can you? I'm not particularly familiar with Aberdeenshire Council's policies on this. I mean, has Aberdeenshire Council, Rhynie, for those who don't know it, is south of Huntly, and I cycle through it quite often. What's the council's position on this? Is it objected?
We don't necessarily have a firm position on it because we are only consultees. It's like any crop that a farmer grows. If a farmer wants to grow corn, trees, whatever, it's not our real business. It's up to Forestry Scotland to accept the recommendations. At the moment, the situation in Rhynie is that they're putting forward a proposal to Forestry Scotland, who will then decide on whether the project will go ahead, and all of the who will simply give an opinion. We have no power to stop this development from happening.
Okay, that's helpful, Jeff. Can I just emphasise, Forestry Scotland will consult. It is a statutory consultation, and I think you undersell the council. You do absolutely have influence and power in this. You're democratically elected. You speak for the people. It may be that that's a weakness in the system. That it's, and I'm going to circle around through this with James and others, but we may need to take that away and talk to Forestry Scotland. But there's no question that there is a pretty robust consultation process, and I wouldn't undersell the council. It's a key player. Let's hear from a couple of others. Lauren, sorry, you wanted to come in. I'll let Lauren in, and then I'm going to.
Sorry, I'll just be very brief. I was really wanting to address the point raised by Doreen specifically, and it was really in relation to one of the proposals that we have put forward in relation to derelict land, and there is also derelict buildings that really become a blight in many of the urban as well as in rural villages as well. They can really cause a lot of distress and distortion to the whole amenity of the communities. But we have put forward this proposal for compulsory sale orders, and it perhaps is likely that they will be taken forward under the Community Wealth Building Bill, which is also being proposed, as well as a land reform bill. But in essence, what our compulsory sale orders suggest is that where a building like perhaps the one that you described, Doreen, has been lying derelict for a long period of time and there has been no movement, there can be a forced sale at a public auction. So obviously the individual who owns the land will get the market value because it goes to a public auction. But it's in that the kind of motivation there is to break an impasse where you have, exactly as you have described, these situations where there are derelict buildings that are causing development not to take place in a particular area. So I think the example that you raised in Fraserburgh would hopefully be pertinent to that. So that's, sorry, Chair, that was the only point I was wanting to interject on.
Oh, thanks very much. And Julian, yes, point taken about Scottish Forestry. Scottish Forestry is accountable to Scottish ministers, and they are required to consult on these grounds. I think many people would argue that the consultation process is far from perfect, but it is there and it needs to be used, and please use it. And please, through your democratic representatives like Jeff, please use it. You're not powerless in this equation. I think if I felt that Scottish Forestry was simply ignoring everybody, I would be more concerned. Whether they pay sufficient attention is another question. And I think, there are different views on that, but it's that's the system that exists at the moment. So please use it. We may come back to this. I do want to let other people in. 25 minutes left. So Emma, thank you for your patience. Everyone's been very patient. Emma, over to you.
Hi, sorry, my Wi-Fi is a bit dodgy, that's why I keep taking my video off. I'm slightly more on the urban side and not entirely relevant to what everyone else has been talking about, but I have a question about the definition of community, for community purchases. I work for a charity based in Huntly, We have recently taken rental of what has been an abandoned building for a number of years, and we're looking to buy the building. But our charity, our constitution covers the area of Gordon because we've been in existence for 40 years, and we have been told that's too big an area to be considered a charity, a community organisation, and we would have to make that smaller. But by doing that, we would actually damage what we do for the community. So it's kind of like, how does that work in with, being able to purchase a building for the good of the community if we then have to be detrimental to the community by reducing what we can actually do for them? So I don't know if there's any thoughts on that. We're kind of at an impasse at the moment, trying to work out what to do, because the building, we're investing heavily in it. We'd like to own it, but we don't want to cut our area in half and not be able to help our communities anymore. And which is what we have done for 40 plus years. So it just seems like the definition is too narrow, particularly for rural areas where you're going to cover a large area, because that's we cover Formartine, Geary and Mar because that's what Gordon became, and that's not our fault that became that. It just is the way it is. But the two things just don't seem to work together. How can we help the community by not helping the community? It's just sorry, I'm not sure if it's entirely relevant, but
it is entirely relevant. Thanks, Emma. And I'm going to come in a minute to Lorne. I'd like first to hear let David in, because he's also been very patient. David?
I was just going to say much discussion about the loss of food production to trees, but there's been a huge loss of food production to housing. And it's the same situation as spruce being the wrong tree in the wrong place. It's the wrong kind of housing on grade A agricultural land, very low density development of quite expensive houses, which is not using derelict land. There's also a lot of derelict houses on large estates that the owners allow to become derelict because they don't want the annoyance of having tenants. So I think that's not been considered, and I think the councils as well have a role to play in this, because they've granted large amounts of planning on floodplains around Inverurie, on agricultural land around Fraserburgh and Peterhead, and that's all been lost to food production. And I'd also like to say on the trees that the storms we've had over the winter show the inappropriateness of spruce as a species for the conditions.
Thanks, David. Some of that's about planning, and we're not a planning authority. I could almost ask Jeff, I don't know if you're on the planning committee, Jeff, but some of that is about planning, but points well made. And there's no question that, planning authorities don't always get it right. It'd be surprising if they did. Whether trees and things should be brought into the planning system is a very interesting area of discussion, and actually one that comes back to Julian's point as well. But I'd like us to respond to Emma, Lorne, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Chair. I think that sounds a real dilemma for you, Emma. I'm not sure, obviously, about the specifics of the case involved. One of the things in terms of land reform legislation is that you have to demonstrate local support for taking forward a proposal. And it may be that whoever is advising that you look to a smaller remit geographically is trying to help you in some way, because rather than you having to get the votes of the wider Gordon population, they're wanting a more focused Huntly, population there. But obviously there's probably a lot to that advice that was given to you. I think, for the benefit of everybody that's listening in, one of the things I would recommend is talking to the land reform team at the Scottish Government, who oversee many of the articles of association that are seen as deemed as eligible, a community body for taking forward a purchase. And somebody like Dave Thompson, that team, would be very helpful in that regard. And also, if you were looking to Scottish Land Fund support towards the purchase, you may well be ahead of the game on this, Emma, already, but having a contact officer, because there are land fund advisors. I think you're kind of nodding, so you may be.
Yeah, the land fund advisors already looked at our constitution and said the rest of it's fine, but we have to define the area further. And by doing that, we're an advice and support charity, and by doing that, we cut out such a huge amount of people that we support that it would undermine what we do and what we have been doing for 40 years. So it's really difficult because we, as I said, we rent the property. It's expanding what we do. It's offering, it's filling a property that's been empty for years. It will be offering opportunities for employment. Obviously, it'll stop it from being such a blight on the Huntley landscape. And there's lots of different things. So
I can see your dilemma. Just because of the specifics on the chat, I'm now going to put my email address, and if you don't mind sending me an email so I can put you in touch with other individuals that can hopefully help you along that track. Is that okay?
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma.
Lauren, thanks. Emma, we will try and tie you up with someone who can help. It sounds ridiculous. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't make sense. And it sounds like the trouble, every time you make a rule, then there's a reason why you should break it. So let's find a way through.
Thank you very much.
James, you obviously have thoughts on all of this, I would imagine, but just go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just firstly on what Emma was talking about, I mean, the definitions are the way they are at the moment. However, one of the things that we have seen in recent years is that a lot of communities, they start down the legislative route and look at all the technicalities, but ultimately they come to a negotiated agreement with the landowner or the property owner. And actually you can circumvent a lot of the difficulties around how big is your community, how many people are in it, how many people are going to have to vote to pass the scheme by entering into negotiations and reaching an agreed settlement. So on that side of things, potentially it's much easier than people imagine. On the funding side, again, there are increasingly more options, and the Land Fund is moving towards having more flexibility in the awards it can make, and that's certainly part of the work that we've been pushing. So it's still early days yet, and as you say, it's quite complicated, but there are glimmers of light to help organisations like yours that are much older, well established, with different remits that don't fit the newer land reform legislation. I can keep going into other subjects if you're happy, Andrew, or we can.
Well, yeah, why don't you? Because there's no other hands up just now, James, and I was going to come to you anyway for thoughts on what you've been hearing. So just on you go.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there's a few things, and it does circle back to the discussion we were having earlier about kind of power and control and decision making. And I think one of the things that Jeff started with was around the carbon market, and the reality is it is an artificial market. I mean, and until relatively recently, no one was buying and selling carbon credits. They didn't exist. But that gives us a huge opportunity, and government a huge opportunity, to shape that market in how those credits are achieved, how they're designed, how they're regulated, how they're verified, how they're bought and sold, and by who. Because there are many issues. I mean, one of the issues that we're currently looking at the moment is people buying land and carrying out carbon sequestration projects, but those carbon credits being used to offset activities out with Scotland and potentially out with Europe or elsewhere. So we're not even in a position where we can guarantee that we can meet our own needs in terms of moving towards net zero. But the opportunity to do that is very much there. And that's something that we've been pushing on in our recommendations around natural capital that we published, I think, towards the end of June this year. Likewise, in a similar vein, the research we carried out into natural capital was incredibly clear that the government support available, particularly for tree planting, is a huge influence on the price that people are willing to pay to buy land with the intention of planting it. So again, we've made that recommendation that the financing and the subsidy system around forestry should be looked at, and particularly not just on the carbon side, but timber prices at the moment have been booming, and there's no indication that that's likely to change, at least in the short term. So much of the public support that was necessary 10, 15, 20 years ago for forestry perhaps isn't as necessary as it is now. And there are other types of land uses, other opportunities that public funding could be better directed to support. So again, that's a recommendation we've made, that the government look at how rural funding, rural support funding in a wider sense, but particularly in the forestry side, is channeled, and whether it's achieving the most it could in terms of the public interest. And I think finally, just coming back to the planning issue again, we touched on the kind of the land use planning, and there is an obvious reason why plantations of trees happen on good agricultural land. It's the same reason developers build houses on floodplains, because it's flat and it's easy to get into. But that's also about ownership as well. The people that are doing those activities buy the best land for their purpose. Developers don't buy cliffs and hills to build houses on, because that would be incredibly difficult and expensive. And it's the same for the forestry industry. But that potentially comes back to better land use planning, better design, better collaboration between existing landowners, communities, local authorities, and other players who all have an interest in ensuring a sustainable long-term development of the region. So I would circle back to the land use partnership that's in pilot in Aberdeenshire at the moment, and really suggest that you, if you can, get involved with that and make your voices heard, and as they develop their framework over the next year or so.
James, thanks very much. I was going to ask you to talk about land use partnerships, so you've done it, so that's brilliant. And Jess, if you can hear me, if there's any way of putting a link up to our advice on land use partnerships, that would be helpful. But the basic idea there is to try and develop a much more joined up and much more inclusive way. Here's Jess asking me to stop being so impatient. I apologise, Jess. The idea of land use partnerships is that there's a much more local, much more inclusive, much more joined up way to making decisions about how land is used, whether it's for trees, whether it's for crops, whether it's for housing, or indeed anything else, shooting grouse or whatever. So that's helpful. So I'm just trying to make sure from my notes that we covered things that people asked. So Doreen, sorry, you asked what's the definition of derelict land. We haven't answered you, and I apologise. So there is a thing called the Vacant and Derelict Land Register, and we, that is kind of used. Local authorities put things onto that register, and it's when we recommended this idea of compulsory sale orders, we were talking about buildings that were on that register, but quite clearly, one person's derelict is not another person's derelict, and again, it's another of these things where there needs to be common sense. But that's the definition that not just we, but people tend to use. The link for the compulsory sale orders work is now up, so that's wonderful, and hopefully that will help you in Fraserburgh. I'm asked about the definition of community, but I think we've sort of talked around that, Emma. I hope we have, in a way. Because at the end of the day, community is what you think community is, because community is a very human thing. And you've made, I think, very eloquently the point that, in some parts of rural Scotland, community can be geographically pretty big. So that's really helpful. Doreen, I see your hand. I'll come to you in 2 seconds. I do just want to pick up David's point about housing, and because we have actually done a lot of work on housing, David, not specifically about where should housing go, because that is a planning matter. It's a matter for local councils and elected councillors to decide, and indeed national planning policy. But more generally, we have made the point that in Scotland, housing far too often, in comparison to many other parts of Europe, where houses go is primarily determined by owners of land. It is not primarily determined by the people of Scotland. But the people of Scotland, through democratic channels, have to respond to planning applications from people who own land. So it's landowner driven. So Megan, I don't know whether this is why you've got your hand up, but I was just wondering if you could just briefly say a little about what we concluded in terms of a more public sector led housing market. You spoke about it in your presentation, but it might be helpful just to quickly say a wee bit more on that.
Yes, although I don't think I can say a lot more, Andrew, because it's maybe the best thing would be for Jess, if you could find the link to the one of the summaries that we've published on this. Basically, in other countries across Europe, what you have is a local authority or a public body taking a much more leadership role from the very beginning of the proposals for a particular development, particularly around housing. And oftentimes, in fact, that local authority is actually bringing the various different development partners together. They're helping to think about the assembly of a site of land ready for development, and then they are taking a much more active role in removing the decisions about how a piece of land is developed for housing out of the free market and into a set of conversations which are focused on what is the best use of this piece of land for whichever objectives, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's about, you know, the creation of a new town, whether it's about regenerating an old industrial area. And really the idea is behind it is that the local authority sets an aim and ambition and then brings all the different partners together towards that aim and ambition, rather than the parameters on the aim of the project ending up being driven by the market. So there's, I think Jess has just put up one of the links to that. Andrew, if I may, one thing I wanted just to touch on, which sort of draws on a whole range of different comments that people have made about the sort of the fact that as James said, as Scotland's land market is not very regulated at the moment, money does talk. And what does this mean for local communities and smallholders? I'm particularly stimulated by Hazel's recent comment about the way in which small-scale regenerative farms can access the sort of opportunities around the natural capital markets and carbon sequestration opportunities. And I sort of skipped through this very much in the presentation at the beginning, but a key part of the work that we're doing around the response to the natural capital investments in the land market and what that means for land reform is this question of how can the benefits from this be shared? And we're not just simply talking about benefit sharing along the lines of kind of wind farm benefit sharing, where a fund is set up and the money is distributed. What we're talking about is how can communities be involved in and able to access these opportunities in a way and in step by step with the landowner, or also on their own in terms of being able to access benefits from these projects. And this is something that we are spending quite a lot of time thinking about at the moment. We have an active research project that is taking place, which is looking at examples of projects, natural capital investment projects, where communities are currently able to share the benefits and are doing so in conjunction with the landowners. And this is a piece of work that we hope to be publishing. I think the first stage of this, James, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong. I think we'll see the first part of that published before the end of the year, but it's a longer term project than that. And that is both trying to look at what's happening on the ground and showcase some successes, but also make recommendations about the kind of wider policy framework and practical guidance for how communities can share the benefits in the future. So I think that in addition to the bigger questions we've had about the role of legislation and regulation and planning and regional land use partnerships, the way in which communities can benefit is definitely on our agenda and is something we'll definitely be focusing on over the coming months. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed. Mark, I think you've got an answer. Sorry, I was going to come to you actually. Mark's asked a specific question, but really important question about new entrants into farming and the use of a new kind of tenancy. And I was heavily involved in 2016 in the legislation and tenant farming stuff, so I couldn't bore you, but I won't, because I think James has given you an answer in the chat. So thank you. Quite clearly, I think it is worth emphasising this. The role of farming and the significance of farming in land reform is of massive importance. And a number of people have made points about food security. It's not just about food security, it's also about making sure that regulation is compatible with farming and compatible with a dynamic fleet of food industry. So it's quite an important point. Doreen, you had your hand up, and forgive me, I sort of cut across you with all this stuff, but did you want to come back?
No, it's okay. I will speak to my property guys tomorrow in the States, and I'll ask them to look at that land register, the vacant and derelict land register. Thank you.
Great. It's available online, Doreen. Just in a couple of minutes, I'll just say what you need to do if you want to talk to us further after this. Because I will, as promised, close at past, but there's just a couple of minutes. Does anyone else want to flag anything? Megan, there's a specific question about regenerative farming. Maybe you could just respond to that one, probably just in the chat is probably simplest. Is that all right? Thanks, Megan. Cheers. Appreciate it. Lauren, do you want any last thoughts? We've got a couple of minutes.
Well, all I would really like is perhaps an advert for the Land Reform Bill consultation, because we're in a unique position that a land reform bill, whatever, probably only comes up once every 10 years, and we have this extended opportunity to get your views in up until the 30th of October. And there is a catch-all at the end of the consultation questionnaire which says, and is there anything else that you basically wish to put forward? So I would just make a plea that this is a really good opportunity for any ideas or proposals, very much reflecting a lot of the very interesting points that have come forward this evening. So there is an opportunity to lodge these points in the consultation. So I would just, Chair, just like to finish with that kind of plea. Thank you.
Well, thanks. So I think that is a great place to finish. So let's wrap up. So just to re-emphasise Lauren's point, government doesn't do land reform every day. So this is a hugely important opportunity. If you go to the Land Commission website, you'll see an entire page devoted to the land reform bill consultation. It's open till the end of October, so you've got time. It is enormously important that lots of people respond and that they contribute lots of different thoughts. What sometimes has happened in the past is the only people who've responded have been landowners, and that doesn't necessarily give you a balanced view. So please, let's have as many ordinary people from all walks of life with all sorts of different perspectives on this to contribute. I'm really hopeful that this will be one of the most, the biggest, sorting out and analysing this will give the civil servants one of the biggest jobs they've had for a while. So let's all fire on this, contribute our thoughts. Any problems finding links and stuff, please ask us. Just to wrap up, one of the great things about Village Hall public meetings is that we close the meeting and then everyone comes rushing up and nobbles me in the corner and tells me the things I didn't want to say in front of everybody else. And I can't do that online. So if you would like to speak to me, or indeed Lauren or Megan or James, please email us. So there's an email address just gone up in the chat. It's just quite simple, info@landcommission.gov.scot. Please email if you would like to have a chat with me, and if you'd like to have a private chat with me that will not be repeated to anybody else, because I recognise that sometimes people are sensitive, and sometimes in rural Scotland in particular, it's wise to be sensitive. So if you want to have a chat with me, email me on that email, give me a time, give me a phone number, I'll give you a ring, we'll have a chat. And that's the sort of nobbling me in the corner after the meeting bit, so please do it. So thank you. First of all, thank you, Lauren, thank you, Megan, thank you, James, and thank you, Jess, who has, although you can't see this, Jess has not only been keeping up a tremendous pace of putting things in the chat, the information into the chat, she's also been juggling 2 small children around me, which I think is extraordinarily impressive to be able to do that. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, all those people. But last of all, thank you, all of you. I do, these meetings work because people contribute thoughts and people engage, and you've engaged, and that's been great. And we've covered interesting ground. And what's fascinating about this is that everywhere we go in Scotland, we get different priorities because Scotland is a diverse country. And the priorities of one bit are not the same as the other bit, which is why we travel around like this. Well, virtually travel around at the moment. So thank you all very much indeed for engaging in the way that you have. I'm most grateful. We will continue to do this every month in different parts of Scotland. We'll be back in your part of the country before very long. I hope, actually, we might be in a village hall. Personally, I like that kind of thing. But in the meantime, have a very safe journey to your kitchen or your kettle or your drinks cupboard or wherever you're off to. And good night. Much appreciated.